abandoned mother hired her son for her million-dollar company. What she asked him to do was a revenge no one can imagine. In the quiet suburbs of Crestview, a modest yet elegant house stood out. Its lush garden was tended to with care. But unlike the vibrant flowers, there was a deep sadness within the house. This was the home of Margaret Thompson, a 65-year-old woman who had been left to live her life in solitude after her children, David and Laura, had moved away. Their visits, which once brought joy and laughter to the house, had ceased, leaving Margaret to live out her days in silence. Margaret had once been part of a loving family. Her husband, John, had been her rock, supportive, hard-working, and kind. Together they raised their children with the hope that they would one day grow into caring, compassionate adults. But after John's passing, things changed. David and Laura grew distant, caught up in their own lives, and soon, Margaret was left alone. One evening, Margaret sat in her living room, gazing at an old family portrait. Her late husband's kind eyes and her children's youthful, smiling faces felt like a distant memory. With a sigh, she whispered, "John, I wish you were here. The children, they've forgotten me." Margaret's financial situation had become uncertain after John's passing, and she knew she needed to sort through his things to see what assets remained. One day, while cleaning out an old drawer in John's study, Margaret stumbled upon something unexpected, an old leather-bound folder filled with papers. As she sifted through them, her eyes widened. It was a portfolio of stocks, investments John had quietly made over the years, which had grown significantly in value. Her hands trembled as she stared at the papers. The value of these stocks was enough to start a small business. Margaret, despite her grief and loneliness, saw this as a chance to do something meaningful, something that could carry on John's legacy. With newfound determination, she decided to take a leap. Margaret cashed in the stocks and used the funds to launch a senior care service, a small initiative to help elderly people who had no family to care for them. She knew firsthand what loneliness felt like, and she wanted to ensure that others didn't suffer the same fate. "I may have been forgotten," she thought, "but I won't let others be." Margaret's business started modestly, with just a few residents and a small staff, but word spread quickly about her compassionate care. People from all over the region began reaching out, seeking help for their elderly relatives who had no one to care for them. Over the years, the business grew and grew, transforming into a multi-million-dollar company known for its dedication to treating the elderly with dignity and respect. Despite her success, Margaret never let the money change her. She continued to live modestly, her only true joy coming from the knowledge that she was making a difference in the lives of those who had been forgotten by society, just as she had been forgotten by her own children. One day, after years of silence, Margaret's phone rang. She hesitated before answering, hoping against hope that it might be one of her children. "Mom, it's David," came the familiar voice on the other end of the line. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. It had been so long since she had heard from him. "David, my dear," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been so long. I've missed you." David's voice was strained, but he forced a warm tone. "I've missed you too, Mom. I've been thinking that I'd like to come see you. Maybe we could talk about the business." Margaret was taken aback. The business? After all these years? Was that what he wanted? Still, the thought of seeing her son again filled her with a sense of hope. "Of course, David. Come anytime. We have much to talk about." A week later, David arrived. He looked older than Margaret remembered, his face lined with stress and exhaustion. As they sat in the living room, David cut to the chase. "Mom, I'm in trouble," he admitted. "My business ventures, they haven't gone as planned. I could really use a job. Maybe something at the company?" Margaret listened quietly, her heart torn. She knew that David had only come back because he was desperate, but she also knew this was her chance to reconnect with him. However, she wasn't going to make it easy for him. "David," she said softly, "I will give you a job, but not the one you expect." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You will work for me," Margaret said, "but not in the main office. I want you to work in my NGO, the branch that takes care of homeless elderly people. You will help them, listen to their stories, and understand their struggles. If you can do that, then we'll talk about a bigger role." David was stunned. He had expected a cushy office job, not a role caring for the homeless and elderly. "Mom, that's not what I had in mind," he stammered. Margaret's gaze was firm. "If you want my help, you'll do this. It's time you learned what it means to really care for someone." Reluctantly, David agreed. His first days on the job were difficult. He found it hard to connect with the elderly residents, many of whom had been abandoned by their own families, just as he had abandoned his mother. Their stories of loneliness and regret hit too close to home, and David found himself feeling more uncomfortable by the day. One evening, after a particularly emotional encounter with an elderly man who reminded him of his father, David began to break down. He saw, for the first time, the pain his actions had caused his mother. The elderly man, once full of life, had been left alone to die in a care home, and David couldn't shake the feeling that he had done the same to Margaret. Later that night, David went to his mother. He knelt before her, tears streaming down his face. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "I've been so blind. I left you when you needed me most, and now I see what I've done. Please, forgive me." Margaret looked at her son, her own eyes filling with tears. "David," she whispered, "I forgave you long ago. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. You must make it right by being better, by helping those who need it most." David nodded, his heart heavy with regret, but also filled with a new sense of purpose. From that day forward, David threw himself into the work with passion and dedication. He became a leader in his mother's NGO, expanding its reach and helping to provide homes and care for even more elderly people in need. Over time, he earned back his mother's trust, and their relationship began to heal. As the company continued to grow, so did their bond. Margaret had taught David the most important lesson of all. Success is not about money or power. It's about how we care for those who cannot care for themselves. In the end, what Margaret had asked David to do had shocked everyone, but it had also saved him.